Probably it's good afternoon now. So I'm Andrea Montanino. I'm the director of the Global Business and Economics program here at the Atlantic Council. I'm really delighted to see you today for the launch of the book by Anders Aslund and Simeon Yankov on the Europe's Growth Challenge. This is really a timely book, and it's a relevant issue. It's not relevant just for Europeans and European citizens, but it's extremely relevant also for the United States. What will happen in the next year to European growth, and whether Europe will continue to play a key role in the world given its size in the economy, and therefore whether it will continue to be the first partner, the most important partner for the United States. I think there are a lot of challenges around, and without higher and sustainable growth, Europe will risk to fall apart. Anders and Simeon books, in a way, show a path towards. They show a number of reforms that can be taken in order to restore growth in Europe. So I'm really delighted that we'll present today this book, and really look forward for the discussion. The event today is part of our Eurogrowth initiative that provide a platform to stimulate thinking on how to restore sustainable growth across Europe, and I would say as a response to raising populism. We are pretty convinced that there are no alternative proposals in the populism in Europe now. So it's by the current, say, leadership or the traditional leadership of Europe to provide responses. We started the Eurogrowth initiative last March. We addressed a lot of challenges. We hosted, I think, 6 or 7 European commissioners, a number of finance ministers, governors, central banks. And we look at several areas and aspects. We made an argument for TTIP. We look at the challenges posed by the surge of the refugees and how this can be transformed in opportunities. We look at Brexit. We analyze how Europe can attract more investment to foster growth. Before I hand over the mic to today's moderator, I would like to ask you all to mark your calendar for next week. Probably you have seen on your chairs a leaflet. On Thursday, January 26 at 12 p.m., we'll have our next event for the Eurogrowth initiative. Will be an interactive panel discussion. Interactive means will be a Q&A with the public, with Ana Palacio, the former Foreign Affairs Minister of Spain, Ambassador Boyden Gray, the former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and General Counsel of the White House under the Bush administration, George Alagoskoufis, professor in Tufts University and former Minister of Finance of Greece, and Shekhar Ayar from the European division of the IMF. We will discuss in particular the challenges in 2017, so we'll look at the short term and how to engage relation with the new US administration in order to foster economic growth both in Europe and in the US. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Caroline Vicini, who will moderate the discussion today. She serves as the deputy head of the EU delegation in Washington. Prior to joining the delegation, Caroline served as chief of protocol with the rank of ambassador at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Stockholm. And from 2004 to 2008, she was already in DC, in Washington, as a deputy chief of mission at the embassy of Sweden. So without further ado, let me hand over to you, Caroline. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrea, for hosting us here today. We are at the EU delegation very grateful for this initiative that you are driving here, providing an intellectual space, so to say, for debates on EU and EU's economy and how to promote growth. And this book certainly fits very, very well into your mission as well. It's my pleasure to be here to become or to be the moderator of today's discussion, and I was particularly pleased to do it because I know Anders Åslund, who is one of the authors of the book since many years, and Anders got well known in Sweden and elsewhere for his pioneer work in both Russia and Ukraine in trying to help those two countries to transfer from a sort of state economy into modern capitalism and market economy. And Anders is now the resident senior fellow here at the Dinu Patriciu Euro-Asian Center. And he has also spent many years at Peterson Institute here in Washington. And he's particularly focused still on Russia and Ukraine and the Eastern Europe. And that's, of course, a knowledge that has served him very well in writing this book. Anders also worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace between 1994 and 2005, and he has also been at the Brookings Institution and the Woodrow Wilson Center. So it's a true think tanker that we have here. And he has paired up with Semyon Dyankov, who unfortunately cannot be here today. He should have been here. He's been retained in Bulgaria for family reasons, I believe. But Mr. Dyankov, who is today a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economies, was a deputy prime minister and Minister of Finance of Bulgaria. And that was between 2009 and 2013. And he has also been a chief economist of the Finance and Private Sector Vice Presidency of the World Bank. He is also the director of the Financial Market Group in the London School of Economics. And he has therefore a very thorough knowledge also of the sort of reshaping of the Eastern countries in the EU that made a fantastic, one must say, fantastic trip from being state economies and to get up to pair with the rest of the western part of the EU. Together we have, today also we have here as a discussant Paul Thompson from the IMF, where he's the director at the Europe Department. And Mr. Thompson is then the person who has the most hands-on experience on grappling with the European economies. He is in charge of IMF's programs with Greece and Portugal. And he also oversees the work of other country teams, including Iceland, Romania, and Ukraine. He worked during the 90s and early 2000s on the economic and social problems in Central and Eastern Europe through multiple assignments in the region. And he has also been a senior resident representative in Europe. So these are people who come from different directions, so to say, but with also a lot of practical knowledge. And we will now have first a presentation of the book by Anders Åslund, and then Paul Thompson will make remarks on from his point of view, and then we will have a discussion. So we're looking forward to that, and I would ask Anders to come up.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Andrea. I'll say that it has been very nice to be working here at the Atlantic Council and write this book, that this is very much a place where you have full freedom to operate and can do it as you think that it should be done. I would also like to thank my wife Anna, who's sitting here, who has been very patient with me when we have been writing this book. And you wonder, Caroline emphasized that both Simeon and I have been working substantially on Eastern Europe. Why did we take this step and move into the European Union like this? Well, for a couple of reasons. The main reason is that we think that the European economy is in a serious crisis. We are used to deal with crisis. And another reason is that we think that the big growth issues, they lie in structural reform. And we think that structural reform has been given far too little attention. And we see that in Eastern Europe, a lot of these problems have been quite elegantly resolved. For example, the tax systems. And coming from Sweden myself, Northern Europe has found quite a few solutions. And we are both following and have lived in many European countries, so that we see ourselves very much as cosmopolitan Europeans, though living here in Washington mainly. So what are the issues? Europe's fundamental problem, I hope you can see it over there, is low growth, 1% less growth a year than the United States after 1975, and there's been no convergence. It's often talked about the golden 30 years after the Second World War, but after that we haven't seen much in Europe. The unemployment, nor is it socially good really, because unemployment is approximately twice as high as in the United States on average. And specifically, there's too little innovation. But our point very strongly in this book is that in each regard, one or usually half a dozen EU countries have done very well, have overperformed the United States. So it's not that Europe as a whole is lagging behind. The point is that European countries had better learn more from one another. Nor is it the same country that is in the lead all the time. It's different countries that have got ahead in various regards. So our message is not that Europe should do what the United States have done, not at all. Our message is that the European countries that are lagging behind in various regards should learn from the European countries that have done better. So let me give you the overall picture of economic growth. And that did not work. And you can see here that Europe essentially has not grown since 2007. We have not the two last years here, but essentially Europe has caught up with 2007 now. This is a miserable picture of 9 lost years. The yellow line on top is the United States. It's not great either, but slightly better. And you can also see that rather than converging, Europe is diverging from the United States. Nobody can be satisfied with this. And what are we seeing today? Here you have a summary of the European situation: Brexit, refugee and migration crisis. Euro crisis has abated, but it's not over. And TTIP is in danger, in particular with the president-elect here in the United States, but not only. So our message is Europe needs to grow more in order to overcome the crisis. Populism is if politicians don't do what is necessary for the good of a country. And what we have effectively seen in Europe is to a considerable extent populism. And therefore we should not be surprised if it takes its expression in more direct populism as we are seeing. And of course, I'm put it here in a graph because you all know it. Higher growth is possible. And Europe can raise its GDP growth by 1% a year through structural reform. This is what the World Bank said in a big report in 2012. This is what McKinsey and the OECD and indeed the European Commission has been saying repeatedly. My favorite work in this regard from the European Union is what Klaus Schwelle from the European Parliament has put out. And fiscal solution is not, stimulus is not the solution. Just a few observations here. We have now seen 8 years of fiscal stimulus. Many people have said that it's not enough. Well, sorry, the space is not there. The average EU public debt is 87% of GDP at the end of 2015. If you take the Eurozone, it becomes a few percent higher. Normally 90% of GDP is set as a level that you should not really exceed. And of course, the Maastricht ceiling is 60%. And the obvious point, fiscal and monetary stimulus do not increase productivity. That's what needs to be increased. But most of all, it has been tried and it didn't work. So what should be done? Here, this is no real surprise. You often hear the argument, the Juncker argument, we all know what to do, but we don't know how to be re-elected after we've done it. That's not quite true. There is no growth agenda clearly expressed. There is a program from when Juncker became president of the European Commission in July 2014. We are quite close to that agenda, I should emphasize, but it is not emphasized as an agenda, and not all the points we have are here. So what I want to go through with you now briefly is the 7 points. Ease the fiscal burden. Second, open up the service market. Thirdly, free the digital trade. Reduce the fiscal and regulatory burden on labor. Fifth, improve higher education and innovation. 6, reform pensions. And 7, complete the European Energy Union. So what should be done? You know, we are all the time discussing the budget deficit. We're discussing public debt, but we're not discussing the fiscal burden. What fiscal burden is right? The EU average public expenditures are 47% of GDP. Other developed countries have about 1/10 of GDP less public expenditure. The person who's really written on this is Vito Tanzi, who is sitting here, who was for 20 years the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. And unfortunately, this never became IMF policy. We are seeing among the EU countries that the fiscal burden varies greatly. 9 countries are in the area that I think they should be, below 42% of GDP, which is several percent more than the US. And you wonder what should be cut. And if you look more closely at it, you see a lot of things that can be cut. The average enterprise subsidies in Europe is 4.3% of GDP. Cut 3/4 of that. Average state administration is 2% of GDP more than in Britain, that has the best state administration of any European country, I would argue. And then, in particular in Northern Europe, there are excessive social transfers. What can also be done is to privatize and pursue fully competitive public procurement, something that is always touchy where you don't have competition in public procurement. So this is quite possible, and it would be good for the economy to accomplish it. So let me show you here what it looks in terms of public expenditures, and you can see how massively they vary from 35% to 59%. Finland in recent years has 59% of GDP in public expenditures for no good years, good reason. What has happened? They have had a triple recession after the global financial crisis. So it doesn't help you with these high public expenditures. On the contrary, and among the countries that have the lowest public expenditures, you find Ireland, that has been in crisis and has gone through the crisis in flying colors. Simply irrational to have these high public expenditures, and nobody pays, or hardly anybody pays attention to them. The second thing is open up service trade. Today, roughly half of the European service market is missing. The EU adopted the Service Directive as late as 2006. The problem is that it looks like a Swiss cheese. It's full of loopholes. And this is the European Parliament numbers, that this could give 1.8% of GDP in extra value added for the European Union. So this is, in principle, quite easy. Expand and reinforce the Service Directive. This is an increasing problem because the service sector becomes ever larger share of the total economy. And here, the European Union does not have the open market internally that the US has. And a very similar case is digital trade. If you travel in Europe and you want to watch Netflix, for example, you need one Netflix card in each country because there is no digital market in Europe. And this is becoming an ever greater problem. I should emphasize here that in the Juncker program of 2014, reinforced service trade and open digital trade are both there. So what we need to do is to push that through the Commission program so that it's actually being done. Create jobs. Here we have many issues. EU employment rate on average is 4.3% less than in the US. And European works on average 4.9 hours less than in the US. And EU unemployment, as I've already mentioned, is about twice as high as in the US. But several EU countries have as low unemployment as the US. Denmark, Germany, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. No insignificant countries. So it's nothing that is a given. But let us look slightly closer what it looks like. Employment rate, this is not unemployment, but employment rate, varies massively from just over half the population in Greece to up to 75% of the population in Sweden. Obviously, European countries can learn a lot from each other here, but then I'll give you a contrarian picture. This is how many hours people worked. And who works the most in Europe? The Greeks. Because the labor market is so regulated that the employers want their workers to work as hard as possible and not hire more workers. While in The Scandinavian countries and Germany, you have the opposite. You need to have a job for various social benefits and also for lower taxes in the family, but you don't want to work many hours. This is a matter of regulation. It's not a matter and taxation. It's not a matter of anything that is given, and indeed, it has not been like this historically. In the 1950s, the French worked more than the Americans. So reduce burdens on labor. What I find most surprising that nobody discusses, it is the massive taxation of labor. Labor is taxed both through income and payroll taxes, while capital is increasingly less taxed than labor. Why? Because labor can't run away. Capital can run away. And after this, people complain about inequality. Well, no surprise. Treat labor decently with regard to taxation. And how do you do that? You cut labor taxation. You can't increase taxation on capital much. I think that this is the big thing, slash the labor tax wedge. Then improve labor market regulation. Many topics there, and improve education, vocational training. Germany, Austria, the Netherlands are outstanding when it comes to vocational training. That's something that the US needs to learn much more of, but also Northern, Western, and Southern Europe need to learn from the vocational training in the center of Europe. Facilitate women's work. Northern Europe is doing very well in this regard, also Eastern Europe, while Southern Europe is doing very little. And, of course, the big theme, absorb immigrants better. Something that is not much noticed either, that is the situation in education. Southern Europe has a serious problem with too little basic education. So Portugal, for example, has only 45% of the population of a labor force completing secondary school, high school, while the normal rate is about 75%. No surprise that you have a lot of unemployment in Southern Europe when higher education is lacking and vocational secondary education is lagging, and vocational education also. For some reason, very little attention is being given to this. I should also say that the quality of education in Europe varies greatly, but we now know, thanks to the PISA studies, and my wife and I happened to be in Finland a couple of years ago when the PISA results were published, and it was almost national sorrow in Finland that Estonia had beaten Finland as the country in Europe with the highest quality of education. All these studies do improve what is happening. And then my fifth point, or our fifth point, is improve higher education and the continent. Something that is not much noticed is that continental EU universities are lagging behind. None of the 25 best universities in the world, according to the Shanghai and Times Higher Education list, is located on the European continent. There are two countries that have all of the best universities: the United States, no surprise, and Britain. While in continental Europe, you have about 6 to 8 universities at this level, and none of them is higher than 29th on either of these lists. So higher education reform should be very high on the structural reform agenda for Europe. And too little financing on research and development. 3% of GDP is desired. Half a dozen European countries are there, but the average is 1.7%. And the big thing is innovative ecosystems. The European system as it is today allows very little venture financing, and much of what exists is public. This is a broader point about liberalization and of capital markets and rendering them more effective. And then reform pensions. This is an old, well-known debate. This is essentially the World Bank report from '94 on pension reform that holds well. Public pensions are excessive. It should be reduced slightly, but the main thing is to improve the incentives, to save. And here I think that there is one wonderful model, the Dutch model, which is the best functioning based on very strong occupational pensions. And if you look upon pensions overall in Europe, as you see on all these graphs, we have lots of them in the book, they show massive differences between different countries. And Holland, with 7% of GDP in public pension costs, is arguably the best pension system in terms of what it provides its citizens with. It's not the question of much the public cost, it is what you get out of it, how efficient the pension system is, that is essential. And then the final point, complete the EU energy union. This is not such a big thing like getting the digital or service market going, but it's something that should be undertaken. So the conclusions we have in the book is that all these reforms are perfectly possible. They can and should be done. The evidence that they are possible is that there are normally half a dozen EU countries who have undertaken them very well. And this makes an important point. EU regulations are no hindrance. People blame Brussels because it's nicer to blame Brussels than yourself. The problem lies with national governments. So if something good would come out of this current crisis of the European Union, it would be that the national governments cannot blame Brussels because it's obviously too weak. It can't impose its rules, and therefore the guilt lies with the national governments. So this is our big message. It's the national government that need to carry out most of these reforms, apart from the trade reforms. The trade reforms, that's the task of the European Union. And if this is done, just to remind you, this is a broad consensus that the EU countries can raise their growth by 1% a year through structural reforms. And note, I did not use the word austerity here, because austerity has nothing to do with it. The question is to build a society that works better for all. Thank you. Paul.
Good afternoon, and many thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to come here, in particular, at the occasion. Anders and I have been working together for more than 25 years in the I could think of nobody else who has, no, not least on Eastern Europe, the insight and the understanding of the political economy of Europe than he has. So it's a pleasure to be here. This is a very, very well-timed and relevant book, and I do indeed think that structural reform and growth is the overarching issue facing Europe at this stage. I had a few slides. Sorry, will it follow? Okay, so it's. I want to first sort of try to make the macroeconomic context on why I think it's absolutely critical, and I am going to focus first on the eurozone and then go beyond the eurozone. So it is first. The short-term outlook for the eurozone is actually not that bad. We have revising growth up. The recovery is on track. We have something like 1.7% growth for the eurozone as a whole this year. But of course, the performance by individual country is very, very different. With Germany powering ahead, and at the other end, Italy still in very well below the pre-crisis level of GDP per capita, and overall the eurozone only having recovered to a limited extent from the pre-crisis level. Now, as I said, the short-term outlook is not bad, but what really is a matter for concern is that the medium-term outlook is quite lackluster, to put it mildly. We assume potential growth for a euro area of some 1.5%, and the implication is that for a number of the countries that are on a particular strain with also, some of them have had programs with the IMF, as you know. As of looking forward from today, it will take Greece another 21 years to reduce unemployment to the pre-crisis level. Italy 12, Portugal 10, Spain 6. It's just an illustration of the tensions that are in the system, and even under our baseline. Our baseline will persist, and clearly, given the political situation in some of these countries, given the pressures, the sort of signs of disintegration in parts of Europe, it's this is of course something that is worrisome. I shall not go much into the detail of that. I think it's a combination of two factors. One is there's clearly some crisis legacies still. There are crisis legacies with very high structural unemployment, very low inflation, and high debt, and still anemic investments in many countries. All to various degree crisis legacies that continue to bear down on growth. We have 6 countries in the eurozone now with debt above 100% of GDP, at or above 100% of GDP. Now, in addition to these crisis legacies, there are some more fundamental long-term structural issues, and getting to what I think is why Anders' book is so timely. I'm not going to give you all the different ways one can analyze the problem. I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples. I'm comparing here Italy and Germany since the adoption of the euro crisis. And you see that manufacturing wages in Italy has just basically one-on-one tracked those in Germany. since the euro adoption. This is manufacturing wages in euro terms in Italy and Germany. Now, because of differences in labor productivity, we have had a steadily widening of, if you want, the competitiveness gap between Germany and Italy since euro adoption, steadily widening year by year to up to about 30% from wherever it was at euro adoption. It's that points to that this is fundamental underlying problems, that not just a question of the crisis legacies, but failure to have we want a structural convergence. Let me just give you the same from a different perspective, bring in some other countries. This shows the real exchange rate before the crisis, from euro adoption until the crisis. And we see that we have real appreciation in most countries, except in Germany, but you had a real depreciation. This next one decomposes it on the what is due to nominal exchange rate changes and what's due to changes in unit labor cost. And the improvement in Germany as Hartz reforms, of course, is striking. Now, this then shows what happens since the crisis. Since the crisis, you have had a significant correction in Greece, in Ireland, in Portugal, in Spain, all who had programs with a fund, and Spain had a program with European partners. You do not have this adjustment in Italy, and you will see that the adjustment has mainly taken place in these countries that were on the program through large changes in unit labor cost. It is and note again that Italy has actually not changed that much. All sort of reflections of the sort of structural tensions inside the Eurozone. I give you just sort of a snapshot of the things that we are, of how one can look at the issue. I think the next one is particularly interesting. This is some work we have done on the German supply chain. To the left, it shows export to Germany. It's you could have one on imports. It's about more or less the same. And the next, the second one showed German foreign direct investments. And note the direction. So we have European monetary integration running north-south. Because of the history of post-war Europe, Cold War, but we have the real integration going east-west. From Germany and German supply chains, and that too, is a picture of the challenges facing Europe, at the structural challenges facing Europe. So, before I get to Eastern Europe, let me just make a sort of couple of points to draw the conclusions as I see it, and the relevance to Anas' book. I would probably not be as strong as Anas is on the role of fiscal policy. Clearly, there is a problem in that that the distribution of the fiscal space and the output gaps in Europe is totally skewed. The countries with fiscal space, like Germany, have no output gap, where the countries with large output gap, like Italy, have no fiscal space. Now remember, and this is, speaking to audience like this, I always struck with how often people forget that. We are inside a currency union that is not a political union. This is the key problem, and this is the overarching issues again and again in what we are dealing with. This is not a political union. There is nothing here that would oblige or call on countries that has the fiscal space to build bridges in countries that do not have the fiscal space. There is no obligation. There's a common currency, there's a common inflation target, but there is no common fiscal policy. There is no fiscal union. So policy conclusion that seems obvious to people who are outside the Eurozone are not obvious if you are inside the currency union. Now, I do think that still that clearly the countries that have fiscal space, like Germany, needs to use that fiscal space. We also need at the same time to push more for central fiscal spending, like the Juncker plan that Anders referred to before, for sure. But we also need, and here I agree with Anders, you didn't use the word, but you implied it, there is clearly a significant moral hazard risk inside a construction that is not a political union. There is clearly signs of with accommodating policies that some countries are delaying fundamental structural reforms. So I think it's critical for a policy mix that is more supportive of growth. I think it's critical that one do the structural reforms needed to boost potential growth, but also critical not only because of the direct economic impact, but to build the political consensus that will enable Europe to use all its four policy variables. Monetary policy, financial sector policy, fiscal policy, there's a role for everything, and structural reforms. But it's not going to happen unless some countries that need to do much more structural reforms do it, and thereby create the political space for other countries to support continue supporting QE, supporting a more active role for fiscal policy. I think it's absolutely critical. Confidence, a mutual confidence in Europe need to be strengthened, not least through these actions to embrace more front-loaded structural reform. And here I agree also with Anders. It's not a question of pointing fingers to Brussels. These are political willingness in the individual member states to spend political capital on difficult structural reforms. That is what matters. A couple of comments on Eastern Europe, which I want to show you just a few things that we have been working on. Clearly, Eastern Europe is doing quite well right now. They basically output is back to pre-crisis level, relatively robust. Actually, unemployment rates are now below pre-crisis level, robust growth. But it is masking the fact that, in our view, potential growth has actually basically halved compared to the pre-crisis level. And meaning that these countries cannot sustain the current growth rates without this kind of structural reforms that Anders is talking about, without seeing renewed sort of external imbalances, if you want to put it like that. Let me just show you an illustration of the problem. We basically taken all the countries in Eastern Europe and shown how do they compare to Korea. Korea being sort of the gold standard of strong emerging markets growth for decades. And you will see that they actually tracked Korea very, very well until the crisis. But since the crisis, it has changed. That they are all deviating with a significant slowdown in potential growth. There are a number of factors explaining that. This is our potential growth estimates and a decomposition of it. This basically shows what is the change in potential growth from before the crisis and to after the crisis. So the change from before the crisis to after the crisis, and you can see basically all of them. That's the dot are negative. So that potential growth is significantly lower than it was before the crisis. And then we ask the question, what is accounting for it? And you can see that overwhelmingly it's accounted for by TFP. and to provide, and I think that provides the context of what Anders is and his co-authors is talking about is, if you want to put it very simplistically, that the first 25 years there were a lot of low-hanging fruit. You close many enterprises that are negative, that are value subtractors, and GDP will go up. It's clearly many low-hanging fruit, question of reshuffling labor and to some extent capital to more productive uses, and you have an improvement in productivity. The scope for these easy catch-up gains in productivity are basically sort of gone. And the next 25 years for Eastern Europe to have the kind of productivity growth that they had in the past, we need to have fundamental structural reforms, but much more focused on improving institutions, improving governance. My last slide is an illustration of some analytical work that we just finishing. That basically here it shows for these variables on the left, with all different parts of the institution's governance issues. We have measured how far are each of these countries on each of these property right legal system from the European average, from the European norm, and then we have some econometric test of what can moving to the European norms, what can that produce in terms of growth for these countries, and we come up with some priorities, and you can, two things. One, as I said, it stresses that the next generation of reforms are much more complex, much more complicated, politically much more difficult. Governance, improved legal systems, business regulations. It's not just a question of reshuffling existing factors of production. And secondly, of course, it shows, which I think is a point that Anders keep on emphasizing also, you cannot, it depends on what country you're in. The priorities changes from country to country, and that again is very obvious from this. So overall, I think this is a extremely timely book. I think it's the key challenges for different reasons for both the Eurozone and for Eastern Europe is indeed to accelerate structural reform. So this is a very timely contribution to the debate. Thank you very much.
So, shall we believe that these work? Yeah, they work now. Great, thank you. Thank you both, Anders and Paul, for these two views on how we should stimulate growth in Europe. I must, before we start, I must really recommend this book. It's a pretty easy read for somebody who is a generalist. I mean, I'm not an economist in my daily work. It's an easy read, and it's also very interesting because it gives really the multifaceted view of Europe that you seldom get here. Because when you talk about Europe here or the EU, there are a few countries that are mentioned, some of them because they are big, some of them because they are in a particularly bad crisis, and occasionally some country, random country, because it has done something that has sort of, it's worth noting. When you read this book, you really see why we have the motto in the EU, which is unity in diversity, because there is a great diversity in Europe, and that's not often something that is not really noted. And the interesting thing is also that there is, as Anders pointed out, there is not one champion. There is not one country that's doing everything right. But you can see most amazing facts sometimes. I noticed something like on I don't remember if it was on Cyprus or on Malta that had pretty low expenditures in healthcare, but had a very low mortality, child mortality, for example, and long life expectancy. And so you wonder, how are they doing it, compared to other countries that spend much more. So it's really an insight in Europe which goes beyond the headlines or the reports we normally see. Having said that, I also want to commend the book, of course, coming from European institutions, that it sort of is really a pro-European book. And that I take comfort in that, particularly in the situation where we are today of some kind of uncertainty that we are feeling around us. Hopefully that will change. But I wanted to start out with a question to Anders before I open the floor on that. That, Anders, you make a very strong case for the European Union, and particularly for the single market, because you want that the single market should be complemented by the digital single market, and that we should sort of create a single service market as well, that you feel it's not really implemented yet. And that is, of course, in stark contrast to the proposals we got this weekend from the president-elect, who suggested that Europeans would not only be happier, but also better off if we sort of, each one went on our own way. Sort of, we kind of split up the European Union and we became nation states, and each one would be able to fend better for itself. And I wanted to ask you what's your view on that?
If you're in a big country like the United States, you don't see how important free trade is. If you're in a small country like Denmark or Sweden, then you realize how important free trade is and access to a bigger market. I heard former Finnish Prime Minister Esko Aho used to be on the board of Nokia in Moscow last week, and he got the nasty question why Nokia had failed. And he said that Nokia succeeded because of a single market, and Nokia failed because there's no single market for digital goods. And in the 2000s, mobile phones increasingly became digital goods, software rather than hardware. So, and I think that this is very well illustrating the situation. And similarly, we are now seeing that Europe is losing out when it comes to the digital market, much in more general terms. Google, Apple, etc. are all US companies, while Nokia and Ericsson ruled the world with mobile phones in the 1990s. And I think that this is a very clear illustration. The smaller a country it is, by and large, the stronger it supports free trade. But of course, this is also generally true, and people don't see it in a big country like the United States, and less in a relatively big country like the United Kingdom. And more on the macro side, what was striking in the early 90s, Europe went through massive currency crisis. And now we have heard from American macroeconomists during the global financial crisis that Europe would be better off with independent currencies. No, thank you. We don't want the currency crisis of the early 90s. So then you wonder, why are so many people in London City in favor of exchange rate, free exchange rates? Well, because then you can make money on currency crisis, which is a big business for hedge funds. That's not a very good business for economic welfare.
Thank you. Paul, do you have something to add on that latter part? I mean, we have the Eurozone that is a limited part of the European Union. Would you say that the situation would have been different if all the EU members were, or member states were members of the Eurozone.
Well, the point I tried to make is that clearly the Eurozone assumed a structural and political convergence that has not yet happened, and we see the strain from that. We see the very high structural unemployment in particular in the south, and I am confident that through a gradual process, these countries will adopt the structural reforms to make it work, and which was in the first place while this was adopted to promote the structural and political convergence. But it's clearly proving more painful than expected. But I would one of the things I always say when I speak outside Europe is, please do not underestimate the European resolve to make it work. I'm confident it will work, yeah.
Okay, so I think we open up the floor. I'm sure there are many questions. Please.
Yes, I'm Reggie Dale. I'm newly arrived at the Atlantic Council. At the beginning, and I'm glad to see you're proudly wearing Swedish colours today. At the beginning, you had a list of problems of Europe, and number one on your list was Brexit. You then seem to not talk about it. But I'm wondering, in light of what you said, one of the big arguments for Brexit people is that unchained from all these EU regulations, there could be a surge of growth in the UK once it becomes global Britain. But you're saying that actually EU regulations are not what's holding back growth. So I'm wondering if this is a false argument. Against which you have to set the fact that the government has now said it's going to leave the single market. So that would be in effect one thing that would be a downward pressure on growth. So how do these two things balance out for a country that's setting a medium-sized European country that's setting out on its own outside the EU?
I'm not calculated on it, of course, but if you take the cost of free trade, that is assessed to be a significant cost. And whatever trade agreement that would come about, Britain will have less weight as a single entity. And if you take small countries, it would be all the worse for them. So free trade is a cost. Britain alone will not get a better trade agreement when the European Union as a whole. And the European Union as a whole has been better at getting trade agreements than the United States by far in the last decade. Regulations, as you rightly point out, it is not a big problem. Much of this, what we call regulation, is international standardization. And the question is simply, what standard do you adopt? Concretely, what kind of electrical plugs, etc., do you use? Of course, the Brits use a separate kind of plugs in any case. But you have a lot of standardization of that nature, but clearly facilitates trade. So you would then have more specifications for more different markets if you break up the European Union and the single market. So the sheer regulation of the European Union is not really there. And I would even argue the opposite. Take the Service Directive that has not been implemented. One country that is violating that particularly egregiously is Germany. You can't go to an ordinary shop in Germany on Sundays because an unholy alliance of churches and trade unions have decided that people are not allowed to shop on Sundays. While in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe and Britain, Ireland, shops are perfectly open on Sundays. So there are certain countries that are violating. So I'm more concerned about the European Commission not being sufficiently strong in imposing its standards. So, and Britain carried out all the Thatcher reforms while being a member of the European Union. There has been a lot of talk about the social charter, but it really doesn't matter. You have all the freedom to do all the good structural reforms if you want to do that inside. I think it will be much more difficult for Britain to do those reforms outside of the European Union with stronger populist pressures. So I really don't understand the economic arguments as you suspected.
Okay, please.
Stanley Kober, I'd like to address the question of austerity. And even in the United States, we're going to see austerity. If you look at President Obama's budget, discretionary spending, both defense and non-defense, go down quite a bit if you project it out to, say, 2023. Why? More payments on the interest as the Fed normalizes interest rates, and people like me will be collecting our retirement benefits. Medicare, Social Security, I'm part of the baby boom generation. The same pressures are going to affect Europe. If these pressures force the discretionary spending here to go down, why wouldn't they have a similar impact on Europe?
Is that you? Or?
Sure. Well, it's I mean, there clearly are a number of long-term sort of structural changes from pension reforms and others that could, if not dealt with, would force such a contraction in discretionary spending. I think that it's, I mean, on the whole issue of austerity, and I'm glad that we sort of did not end up there. Europe for Eurozone unemployment is right now 10%, and our estimate, to the best of our estimate, something like 7-8% of that is structural, and a couple of percent is cyclical. So no, it is. So if you look at the aggregate, that seemed to suggest that there is limited space for a more expansionary fiscal stance, for less austerity, if you want to promote growth and bring down unemployment. The key issue is what I mentioned before: the distribution. That the countries that have the fiscal space are not the one that where the unemployment and the output gaps are. And I do not see, and I said some 6 of these countries, larger countries, have debt that's above 100% of GDP. So I do not see any dramatic change there. I think on the margins, one can ease up on austerity, but if we talk about the growth challenges that are underlying this book, I think that has very little to do with austerity. I agree with Anders on that. It is structural. It is structural, and.
Let me elaborate here. The US has gone from a budget deficit of 10% of GDP in 2009 to currently 2.5% of GDP. Europe has gone through a similar cut in budget deficit. It's about 2.5% of GDP now. So we are in perfect shape. What happens to the economic growth? It has recovered as we would have expected. So the fiscal problem has become much less. And I don't remember the numbers now exactly, but Sweden went from about 80% of GDP in public debt 93 to 40% of GDP in public debt 2007. This was a period of wonderful growth. First you cut public expenditure, then you cut taxes. What is important for growth is that you deregulate. What gave a massive growth in Sweden was the deregulation of the retail sector, trade and banking. So austerity, I mean, I prefer to say fiscal discipline. It has to be maintained. Stimulus has very little to do with economic growth. It is if you are in a real crisis, 2008, 2009. So what President Obama has pursued is really an ideal Keynesian policy. You stimulate heavily early on when you really need it, and then you do away with this excessive deficit relatively fast. It could have been done slightly faster, but this was pretty much as the textbook case, which we rarely see. Normally the politicians are too late, both to expand the deficit and to cut the deficit. And the big problem in the US when it comes to expenditures generally is, of course, healthcare. But it's 17% of GDP, both public and private, while Europe has 9% of GDP in public healthcare and 2% a year and 2% 2 year longer life expectancy. So it's the healthcare system that is the big problem in U.S. public and private finances and generally welfare and efficiency.
So now we have a long list of speakers. I've tried to note you all. I've noted you also. So you, sir, here.
Thank you very much, Vito Tanzi, former IMF, long time ago. You know, I have one observation and one kind of question. The observation is that I think I must have been working in the fiscal area from all angles as a university professor, a graduate student, before I heard the word fiscal space. You know, I still don't know what it means. I have no idea what fiscal space means. It's used all the time. The IMF puts out papers telling us that country have 100% of GDP fiscal space, you know, a recent paper, and I have no idea what it means. You know, that's the observation. It's just like austerity. I don't know what austerity means. You know, France is spending, French government is spending 55% of GDP. The Italian government is spending 50% of GDP, and we talk about austerity. I have no idea what this means. But it's an observation. The question that I have is more difficult and is directed to Anders. You know, I read the book before it was published. You know, I got a draft, and I made a comment to him. But I don't know whether I have not read the book now. I don't know whether it was taken into account, but it was not taken into account in the presentation today, which is income distribution. You know, if you look at the U.S. and instead of comparing the U.S. with Europe or with European countries, you compare counties in the U.S. with the European country. You find counties in the U.S. where there's been no growth for 30 or 40 years, where life expectancy is 20 years less than in the more advanced counties. So the question, you know, shouldn't we really be paying more attention to the distribution within countries? And not just the Gini, but within the countries, you know, when we make this comparison. Thank you.
Yeah, a bit we avoided discussing a comparison US and Europe. This is very much a comparison between European countries, so we did not. We did not go much into the equality discussion, very much because it's infected by Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, which I do not believe much in. What we looked up on the EU statistics for inequality, and there's not much increase in inequality in Europe from in the last 20 years. So we thought that this was too important an observation to be on 1 or 2 pages in the book. So we skipped it. Because if one goes into that saying that Piketty is wrong, one has to do it more thoroughly. I think, as you suggest, that this is very much a US issue, and that the problems in the US are massive. I was just at this American Economic Association conference in Chicago 2 weeks ago, and one of the big themes there is the new increased mortality since 2000 in Appalachians, in particular, in Middle America, the Trump countries, and the 3 causes of increased deaths. Besides your question, but it's quite interesting, it's opioid death, overdose of drugs, it's alcohol, and it's suicides. So what we see here is a truly miserable situation, so that overall American mortality, particularly for women, particularly for white women, has increased from 2000. This is not true of Hispanics, it's not true of blacks, and it's less true of white men. So I think that but this is quite a different area than we are trying to do here, but it's very interesting.
We have a little comment here on fiscal space as well.
Yeah, let me just say that I of course understand that if we are in the world of professors and academics, and sort of these things need to be narrowed down much more carefully. But I do think in the world of policymakers, when I go to Italy and say they have no fiscal space, and go to Germany and say they have fiscal space, they know what we're talking about. So I do think in terms of messaging for policymakers, I think this is not just the kind of language we use. So.
Okay, thank you. As I have a very, very long list, I may ask you to have very brief questions so we can move forward. So, sir, it's you here.
Thank you. Jean-François Rotin with CPE France. And thank you. 2 quick questions. Can there be truly European digital market without a European common language, which does not exist? And
Sorry, I didn't understand. Without
common language.
A common language.
Mm.
And the second question, and that's related to the graphs on East, West, North, South, supply chains in Germany, and a much more interesting graph on manufacturing prices in Italy and Germany. How much should we believe that the euro has actually slowed down the process of structural reforms in the Eurozone?
Could you repeat the question?
How much should we believe that the euro has actually slowed down the process of structural reforms in the countries in the Eurozone?
Yeah, if I start, clearly you can have a digital market. English is the general language, and if necessary you use English. But I'm not a tech person, so I should not get deeper into that, but I don't think that's a serious concern. I'll give answer on your second question, even if it was directed to Paul first. I think that this is quite an unusual situation we have seen after the global financial crisis in Europe, that there has been extremely little structural reforms. Why? Because of massive monetary stimulus. Because countries have not felt the need to do reforms. I lived in Sweden during the crisis in the early 90s. I lived at Oxford when Thatcher came to power, 79. On both occasions, one felt that this is a massive crisis. And Assar Lindbeck, the Dean of Swedish Economists, reported in his memoirs that in 92 he was asked by journalists, will Sweden survive? This was the kind of crisis there was. Here people did not ask, will Europe survive or will any country survive? It was only, will the euro survive, which is a much lesser problem. So the massive stimulus that we saw took away the sense of crisis, and I don't think that is a good thing. Basically, I think that Hayek had a point where, when arguing that the cleansing crisis of capitalism is something that is necessary. You don't want to abolish the business cycle altogether. Not only that you can't do it, but you need to have a certain cycle of cleansing. Then, of course, we don't want to have it too brutal, but something there is needed. And I think that Europe has simply become too soft, and and euro is part of it.
Yeah, I think it's the picture on structural reforms in the euro and is sort of, I would say, a bit more nuanced one. It's
that's your job.
You know, clearly there are some countries where we see evidence of such moral hazard problems. You know, there are countries that have benefited greatly from QE and seen a dramatic decline in interest and have spent that interest. You know, spent this temporary decline in interest on pensions and other permanent, and that's clearly. You know, it's not good if you want to put it like that. There are other countries now, like one that comes to mind is Spain, that has done significant structural reforms, important labor market reforms, and that is performing well. It still have quite a long way to go, but has seen a significant and sustained reduction in structural unemployment, and we are continuing to project relatively robust growth in Spain. So I think it's a nuanced picture. I think what we need to do looking forward is one need to find ways of sort of incentivizing structural reforms. And there are different ideas in Brussels for how to do that. But clearly there is some link on the scope for. I'm trying to find another word than fiscal space, Vita. But there is some sort of link between to what extent one will give. Countries more room, here you have it, to expand fiscally if they undertake structural reforms at the same time. I think it's these are the kind of things one need. So one can improve the incentives. One can reduce the disincentives, the moral hazard problem. But I would not, and I am completely convinced this will require that Europe fires on all the four engines. As I said, monetary policy. Clearly, monetary policy needs to be expansionary, given that we have inflation still well below 2%. It is I think this is obvious. I recognize that comes with potential moral hazard problem, but that's not a criticism of monetary policy. That's a criticism of other policies. So one need monetary policy to be accommodating. One need a fiscal policy where the countries that have the space use it, and one need a bit more centralized fiscal expansion, a la Juncker plan. One need to complete the banking union. That is critical. To sort of sever the link between sovereign risk and the performance of the banking system, and one need above all the structural reforms. And as I said before, to get a country like Germany to support the accommodating monetary policy, to support a more active role of fiscal policy. Germany needs to see that other countries spend political capital on difficult reforms. This is the only way of moving forward. That sort of it's balanced.
Okay, so Mr. Ambassador, I have seen you.
Thank you, Ambassador of Bulgaria. Congratulations on the book. How do you see the future of the Eurozone in terms of further enlargement? And what would your advice be to the countries which are outside the zone? Do they need to speed up the process of accession? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
Was it for me or for Hannes?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You can say that the obvious country that should join the euro is Bulgaria, because you have a currency board in any case, and you have a fixed exchange rate. I was working in Latvia during the financial crisis 2008-2010 with Prime Minister Valdis Dombrovskis, and I was adamantly against devaluation then, unlike Paul, and you have no official position, I presume. And the reason for the crisis in the Baltic countries that was then massive, it was not bad in Bulgaria comparatively, was that the Baltic countries were cut off from ECB, European Central Bank liquidity. And the reason why they were cut off was that they were dependent on Swedish and one Danish bank. Bulgaria was not dependent on banks that were outside of the euro area. You were happy with 30% Greek banks, which had perfect access to ECB liquidity, and also Isitone Credit, Italian banks also that you have. So Bulgaria managed to avoid that. But for the Balts, the conclusion was, we want into the Eurozone as fast as possible. We are not prepared to take this blow again. And the decline there was from 15 to 24% decline in GDP. So it was massive. Well, I don't remember, you had 6% decline or something quite normal for Europe. And I think that for the future, Bulgaria has an interest in getting access to the EU, the ECB liquidity. For the other countries, Sweden can manage. Denmark has a peg since, is it 1982, to the first to the Deutschmark and then to the euro. They should join the euro, but it's not going to happen because they have the same interest in getting into the getting access to liquidity, and they have another problem. They have to buy too large reserves, which is a cost to the country. The Czech Republic, Sweden, Poland, Hungary, Romania, I don't see anything happening. It's simply not politically there. They're floating exchange rates that all of these countries feel function well. Possibly the Czech Republic could come under pressure because they're trying to keep their currency down. So the Czech Republic could be a question. So I would put the candidates Bulgaria first, Denmark second, not likely to happen for political reasons, and then the Czech Republic because of the danger of excessive appreciation of the currency.
Okay, now I try to go the other way to make quicker answers instead of quicker questions. So Antoine, now it's your turn.
Yes, I'm with the European Parliament in Washington, D.C. First, thank you for mentioning the study of the European Parliament on the cost of non-Europe. We calculated that if we integrated Europe more, we would save 1.8 trillion euros every year, with a lot of money. First question is, why do you, I mean, every time I look at the results of the Nordic countries, I'm amazed how how well they do. And why do I am French, as you will have noticed from my accent, and why do you believe that French and other southern countries are not doing so well, and why don't we try to get some good practice from the north? The second question is, do you believe that the electroshock that we expect from the new president here towards Europe, but what he said at least this weekend indicates that he would favor relations with the nations and less with the EU. So do you believe that the electroshock that could provoke could maybe compensate the difficulty we will have with a less intense and vibrant transatlantic relationship? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Antoine. Second question, a clear yes. I think that this adds to the sense of crisis of Europe. Europe has to prove itself. And in particular, we have the French presidential elections in May. That is the real shock. Europe needs to prove itself more before that. My answer on the Nordic countries is very much that they were massively shaken by the crisis 89 to 93. So from 1970 to 1990, Sweden had an average annual growth that was 1 percentage point less than the OECD average. Sweden fell from the 4th to the 18th richest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita. So what happened in the early 90s was a complete rethinking. And you can say that it was essentially that ideology disappeared and it became pragmatic. How do we solve this problem? Rather than should we take a left-wing or a right-wing solution. And I think that you really need a substantial crisis, and it appears to me that the big problem with France and Italy is that they have not been shaken by serious crisis. That they have just muddled through. If you take Italy today, I learned at the IMF yesterday, has a GDP per capita and purchasing power parity, which is the same as it was in '95. And it has been moving too slowly. But life in Italy is nice, so people don't react very sharply, and much of that is true also in France. So you need to shake up society in some way, which is not terrorism, but it's something that concerns the economy, and it's not easily done.
Okay, now we are there. Lady at the window.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Dello, and I'm have spent most of my life as a home care nurse, and each different home had a different way of life, different customs, different priorities, different ways of handling economics. And I went in and you learned to appreciate them all. But perhaps that's a little bit like the countries of Europe with different customs and things like that. How do the countries in Europe feel about being asked to change their way of life and their customs as part of the needed structural reform in order to achieve economic benefit? And also you mentioned Germany a number of times. I wonder if there's resentment about the more economically successful countries in Europe.
Yeah, a good question. I'm not quite sure how I should answer it. Basically, nobody wants to change. You need a serious crisis for people to change. You have a couple of cases where you can say Germany did not have a serious crisis in around 2000 when they had these Hartz reforms that Paul mentioned on the labor market. But they had a sense that they were falling behind seriously. And famously, The Economist had a cover story, I think it was late '99, where they had Germany, the sick man of a euro. It was very much the sense that Germany is doing the worst of them all. So you need to have to go through. And then with regard to what reforms you have, what we have emphasized here in this book is very much how different various European countries are. So for example, the Nordic countries have far too high social benefits, and Sweden and Finland have terribly regulated labor markets. Well, the Danish labor market as well. Why? Because Sweden and Finland are dominated by big companies. Denmark is a small enterprise country. It's much easier then to ease up the labor market. So indeed, I can just agree. You don't get much change without a serious crisis. It's not fun to change. I mean, Bulgaria had a massive crisis, 96, 97, that really put the country on a much better track. And you have a number of different solutions.
Okay, now we have Fran, actually.
Thank you. Fran Burwell from the Council. Anders, you listed 7 reforms, areas of reform. When I looked at the graphs for each one, a number of times I noticed that you had in the good and bad categories countries that were doing well and countries that were not doing well. So it was quite mixed if you looked by each of the reforms you've suggested. Have you drawn any conclusions about which reforms should be priorities or the order of reforms? If you are looking at encouraging these countries, certain countries to reform, are there some reforms that are absolutely essential and others that can be delayed? For example, are you offering options so that politicians can avoid labor market reforms, which might be more difficult?
The OECD does this. They put 5 top reforms for each country, and it's unreadable. You can't read it and get in some context. If you write a book and want to keep it to 200 pages, and you want to get an overview, you can't do that. But you have certain very general tendencies. You can say that Eastern Europe has got the tax system and the public finance systems in a pretty good order. It's a particular group of countries that have got labor markets into good order, which is Germany, Britain, Ireland, Denmark. I would pick these. My big favorite when it comes to pension system is Holland. And when it comes to liberalization of service markets, the Nordic countries are doing very well. When it comes to research and development, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Britain, Germany. So you have different countries for different groups that are doing well. We are not trying to say which reform should what country do, but if you take it in general, I mean, Greece and Italy look as the 2 countries that are lagging behind in most regards. Well, for example, Spain and Portugal have done some substantial reforms and look good in several regards, not only because of Simeon Djankov being my co-author. We have quite a few positive features of Bulgaria.
Okay, now it's the gentleman here.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council, and I have a question for Anders. Prefaced that a year ago, nobody expected Donald Trump to become president. So in that context, I'm going to ask a question about Europe's challenge rather than its just growth challenge. You argue, I think correctly, that Europe is going to need some kind of a crisis. Well, the Soviet Union had a pretty good crisis in 1990, and it went poof. Now you have a whole series of sub-crises breaking out. Trump here, Putin from the east, Brexit as the precursor of the elections that you're talking about, the fundamental contradiction in the EU of monetary currency but no political union. Who's going to lead in all this? And how do you see the necessary political forces to be generated in Europe when I don't know who the spokesman for Europe is in Europe. You take a look at Trump's cabinet, Jim Mattis is probably the strongest spokesperson for Europe, and he's only going to be the Secretary of Defense. So what do you see as the internal dynamics in Europe that would really make the case for the structural reform that I think you rightly argue? But I think in this case, implementation is going to be a real issue, and I'm, at this stage, more pessimistic about this taking shape.
Harlan, good question, and I will carefully avoid making too many public statements about too many persons. It's quite obvious that the leader today in Europe is Angela Merkel, and there's nobody else who can really rival her. I think that most small people from small nations strongly regret that Great Britain is no longer there, because Great Britain, as Harold Nicholson emphasizes in his old book, Diplomacy, has a strong tradition of taking care of small countries, which France, on the contrary, does not have at all. And Germany has developed it very much under Angela Merkel. So she's the only clear leader. One would like to see stronger leadership in the European institutions, but it's difficult to see it today. I mean, it's not even news that the European Parliament got a new president, Antonio Tajani, yesterday, because nobody actually pays attention.
The same when Juncker was elected, nobody knew who he was.
So, Paul,
just on the structural reforms, as I said, I do think that Anders is right in pointing to the importance of it. But I also do sense we should not be too dismissive of what has been achieved and what is going on on the structural reform side. Well, I mentioned Spain before. If you look at the candidates for the presidency in France, the sort of the center candidates, I think they all embrace, to various degrees and with different focus, but definitely focus on structural reforms. You will see an article, I think it was today's FT, that marvel about the fact that Macron has a surge in the poll, even though he is really calling for structural reforms, painful structural reforms. I think even in Italy, Renzi early on did some very important structural reforms. The political situation is more difficult, but I do think that there is. I do think that European policymakers are quite conscious about what has to be done. It's politically not easy, but we have come quite some way. If I think I've been to every Eurogroup meeting in the last 5-6 years since the crisis started, meeting of European Ministers of Finance. And I can assure you, they have come a long way in their structural reforms, in their architecture. They are close to having a banking union. They have firewalls. They have a crisis management mechanism in place, and they have again a number of countries that have run significant structural reforms. So I would not. I would sort of there's always the discussion of whether the glass is half full or half empty, but Europe has come a long way the last 5 or 6 years. That's my view.
We have time for one more question, and that's the gentleman there behind with the glasses.
Thank you very much. Altı Önlen from Istanbul. I want to ask a question about Turkey. Turkey has been trying to become member of European Union, and it has 80 million people with 27 average age. And although there are many civil wars around itself, its latest growth rate is 3.5%. Compared to many European countries, it's highly better. And it's also highly better than many European countries like Greece, Romania, Macedonia. So what's your perception on Turkey's application on European Union? And if Turkey gets accepted by European Union to become a member of European Union, would it be good for European Union overall? And would it increase growth of European Union?
Well, this is very much a political question. First, Turkey has done extremely well since '96, when the customs union with the European Union came into force. And was it in '59 that Turkey applied for membership of the European Union? And this has just been lying aside since then. The greatest period, I think, was 2002 to 2006, during the first term of then Prime Minister Erdogan. But at current, you know, it's more political issues that would block Turkey. Previously, we had the situation that particularly France, for various political reasons, opposed the membership of Turkey, while Germany was hesitant. The Nordic countries were by and large in favor of Turkey joining. I think that now the question is simply dead for quite some time because of the recent unfortunate events in Turkey and the EU reaction to it. I don't really deal with it. It's just, so to say, an expert assessment of where the situation is. Of course, if Turkey would join, it would change the European very considerably, and there are quite a few of my friends who think that this could be the revival of the European Union that Harlan talked about here for other reasons. So there are certainly strong reasons for it. We can say that the expansion of the European Union to Eastern Europe has strongly revived Europe, and in particular what Paul talked about here, the German supply chain into Central Europe has been a strong reviving effect. And you can say that Italy suffers from not having close countries as Germany has with Central Europe, and therefore not being able to benefit as much from outsourcing. You know, outsourcing is not a bad word in Germany. It is a bad word in the United States, because Germans understand that their big companies would not survive as they do now if they couldn't outsource. I don't understand why Americans don't understand that also.
So, thank you very much, Anders Åslund and Paul Thompson, for a very interesting couple of hours. There are some topics that were never raised in this, and one of them kind of touches a bit of what you say. It's, for example, the importance of immigration to Europe, which is the reverse picture of what we usually get here. Also, something very important, I think, education in Europe, where we can certainly look to the United States. But that just should spur you to read a book. Unfortunately, I have to rush off, and I know there are a couple of not so happy people here, but maybe Anders and Paul could give them a few minutes to get answers to their questions. But I have 28 member states waiting for me, so I have to run. Thank you very much.
Thank you.